April 6, 1942, 25,000 feet above the Coral Sea, a 19-year-old bombardier named Stevens pressed his face against the Norden bomb site. The device the Air Force called a miracle. The device that could supposedly drop a pickle into a barrel from 3,000 feet. Below, through layers of tropical haze that turned the ocean into hammered blue steel, a Japanese aircraft carrier cut through the water. A floating city of steel and gasoline, hundreds of feet long. From this altitude, it looked like a splinter in a swimming pool. Stevens's hands were numb from the cold, his oxygen mask fogged with each breath. He adjusted for wind speed, for air density, for the drift of the plane. The Norden bomb site was a mechanical marvel. Gyroscopes, mirrors, lenses. It cost more than a house back in Cleveland. He lined up the crosshairs, released the payload. 4 1,000-pound demolition bombs dropped from the belly of the B-17 Flying Fortress. They fell for 37 seconds. That is a lifetime in war. In 37 seconds, a Japanese ship captain can finish his coffee, check his compass, and order a hard turn to starboard. The bombs whistled down toward the ocean surface. Captain Harl Pease, the aircraft commander, waited for the impact, waited for the plume of fire that would signal a hit. Instead, 4 white geysers erupted from the water, 300 yards off the carrier's port side. The Japanese ship didn't even bother to fire its anti-aircraft guns. It just traced a lazy white wake in the water and steamed away. They weren't afraid. They were bored. This was the reality of the air war in early 1942. The American 5th Air Force was failing. They were throwing millions of dollars of high explosives into the ocean, killing nothing but fish. Against moving ships, high-altitude level bombing had a success rate of less than 1%. 1%. You had better chance of winning the lottery than hitting a Japanese destroyer from 20,000 feet. The Japanese knew it. Their convoy commanders stopped zigzagging. They stopped sailing at night. They sailed right down the coast of New Guinea in broad daylight, their decks stacked with troops and supplies, laughing as American bombs splashed harmlessly into the sea. They called the American bombers blue sky noise, loud, impressive, and completely useless. By the end of 1942, one man would prove that everything the Air Force thought it knew about air warfare was dead wrong. But first, he'd have to break every rule in the manual and build a weapon the experts said was impossible. In the humid, mosquito-choked officers' club at Port Moresby, the mood was poisonous. Pilots were risking their lives flying obsolete machines through tropical storms only to watch their missions fail over and over again. They knew the doctrine was broken. The manual said to fly high to avoid anti-aircraft fire. The manual said the Norden bomb site was a miracle weapon. But the manual was written by men in air-conditioned offices in Washington, D.C. Men who had never tried to hit a destroyer that was turning at 30 knots while a Zero fighter chewed up their tail. Major Jack Brennan sat alone at a corner table staring at a map of the Pacific. He was 42 years old, ancient for a combat pilot. His hands bore the marks of years working on aircraft engines, burn scars from welding torches, calluses from wrenches. His face looked like sun-baked leather left too long in the Philippine heat, deep lines carved around his eyes. His hair, once dark brown, was now streaked with gray. But it wasn't the war that had put those lines in his face. It was December 8, 1941, the day the Japanese invaded Manila, the day his wife Margaret and their 4 children were thrown into the Santo Tomas internment camp. Emma was 14, old enough to understand what was happening, old enough to be afraid. Robert was 11, Catherine 8. Little James, just 5 years old, probably didn't understand why Daddy wasn't coming home. Jack kept a tally in a small leather notebook. Every Japanese ship that slipped past American bombers, every convoy that delivered troops and supplies to fortify the enemy's hold on the Pacific. Every ship was another day his family suffered behind barbed wire. Another day, Margaret grew thinner. Another day, Emma had to be strong for her younger brothers and sister. 43 ships in January, 57 in February, 61 in March. The experts in Washington said the doctrine was sound. Fly high. Stay safe. Let the Norden bomb site do its magic. But Jack Brennan had stopped listening to experts. If you or someone you love served in the Pacific during World War II, this story will remind you why that generation earned the title the greatest. This is the story of how one mechanic with a toolbox and a family to save changed the course of air warfare forever. Before the war, Jack Brennan had been nobody special, just a mechanic who taught himself to fly. In 1935, he'd scraped together enough money to buy a broken-down Stinson Reliant and started Manila Air Services. One plane, one pilot flying cargo and passengers between the Philippine Islands. By 1941, he had 4 planes and a reputation as a man who could fix anything with nothing but a wrench and some wire. He'd been in Mindanao on a cargo run when the Japanese bombers hit Manila. The radio crackled with chaos, explosions, screams, static that sounded like the end of the world. He tried calling home. For 6 hours he tried. Finally, at 11:47 p.m., the line connected. Margaret's voice came through thin and frightened. "Jack, they're coming down the street." Emma's crying. "The boys." Then his daughter's voice, high and panicked. "Daddy, Daddy, they're coming." They're static. Jack tried to fly back to Manila. He was ordered to Australia. Ordered. While his family was being rounded up like cattle. He landed in Brisbane 3 days later. He didn't sleep for 48 hours. When he finally did, the nightmare started. Emma's voice cut off mid-scream, playing on an endless loop in his mind. The old Jack Brennan had cried, had prayed, had hoped. The new Jack Brennan stopped crying. He stopped praying. He started counting. Every Japanese ship that made it through, every convoy, every transport. He wrote them down in his notebook with the date and location. The psychiatrists would later call it obsessive coping mechanism. Jack called it staying sane. Every ship he counted was a promise that he'd find a way to stop them. In April 1942, Jack was assigned to the 5th Air Force in Port Moresby, New Guinea, the rear end of the war. The forgotten theater where pilots flew obsolete planes through tropical storms to drop bombs that never hit anything. The first thing he noticed was the smell, jet fuel mildew and defeat. The second thing was the planes. Rows of B-25 Mitchell bombers. Beautiful machines, twin-engine medium bombers with sleek lines and powerful Wright Cyclone engines, sitting idle because nobody could figure out how to make them useful. The Air Force had designed them for medium-altitude precision bombing. But precision was impossible when your target could turn at 30 knots and your bomb fell for 20 seconds. Jack walked the flight line that first night, running his work-worn hands over aluminum skin, counting rivets, thinking. The other pilots thought he was crazy. Maybe he was. Within 3 months, Jack Brennan would turn one of these useless bombers into the deadliest weapon in the Pacific. But the transformation would require breaking laws, defying generals, and risking a court-martial. It would start with a wrecked plane destined for the scrap heap and a toolbox. May 15, 1942, Jack flew his first mission as a co-pilot. The target was a Japanese supply convoy heading to Leh. 6 destroyers, 4 transports. Enough firepower to supply the enemy for months. The briefing was textbook. Maintain altitude 22,000 feet. Avoid anti-aircraft range. The Norden will handle the rest. They climbed for 40 minutes, oxygen masks on fingers numb with cold. Through breaks in the clouds, Jack could see the convoy. Tiny gray slivers on the blue ocean below. Stevens, the bombardier from Ohio, hunched over the Norden, calculating, adjusting. The device was a mechanical marvel. Gyroscopes and mirrors and lenses. Bombs away, Jack counted. 23 seconds. 4 bombs. 4 splashes. 300 yards wide. The Japanese didn't even zigzag. They just kept going. That night, Jack sat in the officers' club with a warm beer in his notebook. The other pilots were playing cards, trying to forget another wasted mission. Captain Sarah Hartley walked in. 29 years old, a Berkeley engineering graduate who'd been rejected by Boeing because she was a woman. She joined the Army Air Force as an intelligence officer and now ran photo reconnaissance analysis. She saw Jack's notebook and frowned. Keeping score, Major. Someone has to. The doctrine is sound. High-altitude bombing minimizes casualties. The Norden is a toy, Jack interrupted. A very expensive toy that kills fish. It's physics, Major Brennan, given sufficient data, altitude, wind speed, target velocity. The mathematics are irrefutable. Jack looked at her, really looked. She believed it. believed in the equations, the doctrine, the manual written by men in air-conditioned Washington offices who'd never watched a Japanese convoy sail away, laughing. You know what's irrefutable, Captain? My wife weighs 90 pounds by now, maybe less. My daughter is 14, old enough to be useful to the guards. That's irrefutable. Every ship we miss is another month they're in that camp. So forgive me if I don't give a damn about your mathematics. Sarah's face went pale. She opened her mouth, closed it, then turned and walked away. Sarah Hartley would become Jack's strongest ally, but first she'd have to watch him do something that would make her question everything she'd learned at Berkeley. That moment would come at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in a hangar lit only by flashlights in Rage. After Sarah left, General Frank Kenmore appeared at Jack's table, 53 years old, built like a fire hydrant, a face that looked like it had lost arguments with several walls. Everyone called him Bulldog, though never to his face. Walk with me, Major. They walked outside into the New Guinea night, thick with humidity and mosquitoes. The kind of heat that made your uniform stick to your skin and your thoughts move like molasses. I've been reading your file, Kenmore said. Before the war, you built an airline with 4 planes and no money. Fixed engines with parts you machined yourself. Yes, sir. The doctrine isn't working. You know it, I know it, but I can't change it from here. Washington won't listen to reports. They need proof. Kenmore stopped, turned to face Jack. Show me something that works, Major. I don't care if it's in the manual or not. Show me, and I'll protect you from the consequences. Jack felt something shift in his chest. Permission. Not official, not written, but real. I'll need a plane, sir. One nobody cares about. There's a B-25 in the boneyard, tail number 43-22742. Took a hit in the tail, but the airframe's solid. It's scheduled for scrap. Not anymore, sir. That night, Jack Brennan walked to the aircraft graveyard with a flashlight and a socket wrench. What he built in the next 6 weeks would change air warfare forever. But first, he'd have to convince a team of mechanics to help him build something that looked like suicide. The boneyard sat at the edge of the airfield, a graveyard of twisted aluminum and broken dreams. B-17s with missing wings, P-40 fighters burned to charcoal, broken propellers stuck in the mud like grave markers. And there in the back corner, B-25 tail number 43-2742. Jack circled it 3 times under the pale moonlight. The tail section was damaged, crumpled from anti-aircraft fire, but the engines looked salvageable. The wings were intact. The fuselage was solid. The nose, that fragile glass greenhouse designed for a bombardier. It looked pathetic, vulnerable, wrong. Jack put his palm against the aluminum skin, still warm from the day's heat. He closed his eyes and saw it, not as it was, as it could be. You're not a bomber, he whispered. You're a fighter that doesn't know it yet. Sergeant Duke Morrison found him there an hour later, 30 years old, from Amarillo, Texas, best mechanic in the 5th Air Force. He'd been working on aircraft since he was 16 when his daddy's crop duster needed a new engine and they couldn't afford to buy one. Sir, that plane's headed for scrap. Not if I can help it. Duke looked at the B-25, then at Jack, then back at the plane. He'd heard the stories about Major Brennan, the man who'd lost his family in Manila, the man who kept a notebook of ships, the man who flew every mission like it was personal. What are you thinking? Jack told him. All of it. Strip the glass nose, mount heavy machine guns, fly low, strafe the enemy ships until they couldn't fight back, skip bombs into their hulls like stones on a pond. Duke was quiet for a long time. The night insects sang in the jungle beyond the airfield. Somewhere in the distance, a generator hummed. The engineers will say it can't be done. Center of gravity, structural limits, recoil forces. The engineers aren't watching their families starve in a prison camp. Duke nodded slowly. I know a welder, Luis Hernandez, best torchman I ever seen. And there's a kid, Tommy Chen, electrical wizard, 19 years old, smart as hell. Can they keep their mouths shut? They're from Texas and California, sir. We don't much trust people who tell us what we can't do. This is what made that generation different, folks. They didn't wait for permission. They didn't form committees. They found a problem, grabbed their tools, and fixed it. That's the American way. That's why we won. They worked between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m. when the inspection teams were asleep and the sentries were lazy. Duke Morrison. Luis Hernandez, a 32-year-old welder from El Paso with hands like leather and a tattoo of the Virgin Mary on his left forearm. Tommy Chen, 19 years old from Sacramento, who could wire anything that needed electrons. The first night they just stripped the nose, ripped out the Bombardier's seat, the Norden bomb sight, the oxygen lines, the map table, the delicate brackets, everything. By 3 a.m., the nose was an empty aluminum shell, a hollow cone waiting to be filled with violence. Now what, Sir Luis asked, wiping sweat from his forehead with a rag that was already soaked through. Now we make it angry. Jack had been scrounging during the day. 450 caliber Browning M2 machine guns from wrecked P-40 fighters pulled from the boneyard. Steel I-beams from a collapsed warehouse near the harbor. Lead ballast from a sunken cargo ship in the bay. All of it collected piece by piece. All of it technically stolen. All of it necessary. The plan was simple and brutal. Weld a steel cradle inside the nose. Bolt 4 guns into it. Add 4 more in blister packs on the fuselage sides. 8 forward-facing guns, all firing at once, all controlled by one trigger on the pilot's control yoke. Sir Tommy said carefully, the recoil from 850s firing simultaneously. That's going to slow the plane down. Maybe 15-20 miles per hour. And the weight. I know. We'll add ballast to the tail, balance it out with whatever we can find. Over the next 2 weeks, Jack's team became creative thieves. Steel from bomb buildings, requisitioned for essential war purposes. Lead weights from the recreation center, needed for aircraft testing. Electrical solenoids from the officers' club slot machine. Broken anyway, Duke grinned. Now it's really broken. Ammunition feed chutes fabricated from scrap aluminum. Luis could weld underwater in the dark with one hand tied behind his back. This was easy by comparison. His torch sang in the night. Sparks showered like fireworks. The smell of hot metal filled the hangar. The hardest part was the firing circuit. 8 guns needed to fire simultaneously from one trigger. Tommy Chen worked for 3 days straight, surviving on coffee and peanuts, his eyes red-rimmed and bloodshot, until he had a system that wouldn't fry itself the first time Jack pulled the trigger. But there was one problem they couldn't solve with scraps and midnight welding. The physics. On paper, the modifications Jack was making should tear the plane apart the moment it left the ground. The answer to that problem would come from the last person Jack expected, and it would arrive at 2:47 a.m. in the form of a knock on the hangar door. June 23, 1942, 2:47 a.m. Jack was under the plane helping Luis weld a gun mount. The torchlight flickered orange against the aluminum belly. Sparks rained down onto the concrete floor. The air smelled of ozone and hot metal impossibility. He heard the hangar door creak open. Footsteps. Light. Measured. Too deliberate to be casual. He rolled out from under the fuselage to find Captain Sarah Hartley standing there with a flashlight and a notebook. Her uniform was crisp despite the late hour. Her hair pulled back in regulation style, but her eyes were different. Not the certainty he'd seen in the officers' club. Something else. Curiosity. Maybe concern. Captain. Major. She looked at the B-25. 4 gun barrels protruding from the nose like angry hornets. 2 more blister packs half installed on the sides. Piles of ammunition belts coiled on workbenches. The guts of a slot machine spread across a table. Tommy Chen's wiring diagrams taped to the wall. I should report this. Yes, ma'am, you should. Sarah walked around the plane slowly. Her flashlight beam caught on welds and rivets and improvised brackets. On the steel cradle that looked more like bridge construction than aircraft engineering. On the lead bars visible through an open access panel in the tail. The center of gravity is shifted at least 18 inches forward. When you try to take off, the nose will drop. The plane will crash before you clear the runway. I know. Then why? Jack walked to the tail of the plane and pointed his flashlight at the lead bars bolted into the rear compartment. 340 pounds. Move the radio equipment back here too. Another 120 pounds. It'll balance. Sarah pulled out her notebook, started calculating. Her pencil moved across the page. Numbers and equations. Muttered words under her breath. Angle of attack. Pitch moment. Center of pressure. You're off by 3 degrees on the pitch angle. At rotation speed, the nose will still be too heavy. So I add more ballast. Or remove weight from the front. Can't. Need all 8 guns. She calculated again. Looked at the plane. Looked at Jack. Her expression was unreadable. Reduce ammunition load by 20%. Store it further aft. Move the hydraulic reservoir from the nose to the mid-fuselage. Jack stared at her. That'll work. The math says it should. Emphasis on should. Why are you helping me? Sarah was quiet for a moment. The hangar was silent except for the hum of distant generators and the chirp of night insects outside. Duke and Luis had stopped working. Watching. Waiting. My brother was on the USS Houston when it went down in Sunda Strait. The Japanese wouldn't have gotten close enough to torpedo it if our bombers could actually hit anything. She handed him the notebook with her calculations. Pages of precise engineering. The kind of work that took hours. If you're going to break the rules, Major, at least don't break physics while you're at it. She turned to leave, stopped at the door. I'll be in the control tower when you test fly this thing. Someone should be there to write the incident report when you crash. She stayed for the next 3 nights, recalculating, adjusting, checking Tommy's wiring, Luis's welds, Duke's measurements. She never explained why. Jack never asked. Some things don't need words. By the end of June, the modifications were taking shape. The steel cradle Luis had welded inside the nose looked like something from a suspension bridge. Crude, heavy, ugly, but strong enough to anchor 450 caliber machine guns that would each generate 3,000 pounds of recoil force. The ammunition system was Tommy Chen's masterpiece. 8 separate feed chutes, each connected to ammunition boxes mounted throughout the plane. The system had to be flexible enough to handle vibration, but rigid enough to prevent jams. He'd tested it 100 times. Click, click, click. 8 perfect sequences. The firing circuit used that solenoid from the officers' club slot machine. 1 button on the pilot's control yoke. 1 electrical impulse. 8 guns firing in perfect synchronization. Test it, Jack said. Tommy pressed the button. 8 sharp clicks. Perfect timing. Again. Click, 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 click. 1 more time. Same result. Duke grinned. That's the prettiest sound I've heard since my wedding day. The weight problem was real. With 8 guns mounting hardware ammunition, in the steel cradle they'd added nearly 1,000 pounds to the nose of the aircraft. Sarah's calculations required precise balance. They built a makeshift scale using a forklift, some steel drums, and a level that Luis borrowed from the engineering depot. They'd lift the tail, measure the angle, calculate the center of gravity, add ballast, measure again. It took 6 days of micro-adjustments, moving radio equipment, repositioning fuel tanks, adding lead bars, removing them, adding them back in different locations, each change measured, each change calculated, each change bringing them closer to something that might actually fly. Finally, on July 4th, Independence Day fittingly, the plane balanced. We did it, Duke said quietly. No, Jack corrected. We built it. Now we have to fly it. The test flight was scheduled for July 18th, 1942 at dawn. If the plane flew, Jack Brennan would have a weapon. If it crashed, he'd have a court-martial. Either way, he'd have his answer. But what happened that morning would shock everyone, including Jack himself. They couldn't test-fire the guns in the air yet, but they could test them on the ground. July 12th, they towed the B-25 to an isolated corner of the airfield, set up sandbags and targets, old fuel drums arranged at 100 yards. Duke, Luis, Tommy, and Sarah stood 200 yards back, fingers in their ears. Jack climbed into the cockpit, the familiar smell of aviation fuel and oil and aluminum. But different now. The plane felt different, heavier, meaner, like a body that had been taught to fight. His hand hovered over the trigger button. 8 guns, 8 streams of 50 caliber death. This was the moment. Either the airframe would hold, or it would shake itself to pieces. He pressed the button. The sound was like the sky being torn in half, not individual gunshots. A continuous roar, like an enormous piece of canvas ripped by giant hands, the whole airframe quaking with contained fury. The vibration traveled through the seat into Jack's spine. The targets, those old fuel drums, they didn't just get perforated, they disintegrated, transformed into shrapnel and smoke in a heartbeat, metal fragments spinning through the air, the sound of impacts like a violent hailstorm. Jack held the trigger for 3 seconds. In that time, 800 rounds downrange. The recoil tried to shove the entire plane backward despite the locked brakes. The smell of burned gunpowder flooded the cockpit, so thick it made his eyes stream and his throat burn. He released. The sudden silence felt unnatural. Smoke drifted across the tarmac. The gun barrels glowed faint red in the morning light. Duke was the first to speak. Holy Mother of God. Luis crossed himself, touched the rosary beads around his neck. His lips moved in silent prayer. Tommy just laughed, a sound somewhere between disbelief and joy. Sarah wrote in her notebook, structural integrity maintained. Recoil within acceptable parameters. Recommend reduced burst length to prevent barrel overheating. Always the engineer. Always precise. That night, a telegram arrived from California. Dr. Theodore Walsh, chief engineer at North American Aviation, the company that built the B-25. The telegram was long, technical, scathing. It said the unauthorized modifications would result in catastrophic failure during takeoff. It said the center of gravity shift was outside acceptable parameters. It said the aircraft would nose into the ground. It recommended immediate cessation of modifications. It recommended court-martial proceedings. Jack read it twice, then handed it to Duke. What do we do? Sir Jack walked to the window. Outside, under dim work lights, sat their creation, B-25 number 432742. Not graceful, not pretty, but ready. We fly it. And if Walsh is right, then I'll be too dead to get court-martialed. Duke smiled. When do we go dawn? July 18th. Just me. If this thing is going to kill someone, it'll be me. That's what real courage looks like, folks. Not charging into battle with 1,000 men behind you. It's climbing into a machine that every expert says will kill you, because you believe in something more than your own life. Jack Brennan believed in getting his family back, and he was willing to bet everything on a plane held together with scrap metal and rage. At 5:47 a.m. on July 18, 1942, Jack Brennan would start the engines on that modified B-25. The runway at Port Moresby was 4,200 feet long. The jungle started at 4,201. Either the experts were right and Jack would die in a ball of fire, or everything the Air Force thought it knew about air power was about to change forever. The sky over Port Moresby was the color of a fading bruise, purple and gray with streaks of orange bleeding across the eastern horizon. The humidity was already oppressive at 5:30 a.m., the kind of wet heat that made breathing feel like drowning. Jack Brennan walked across the tarmac alone. He'd forbidden the others from coming. If this went wrong, he didn't want witnesses who'd feel guilty for the rest of their lives. But they came anyway. Duke Morrison stood with his arms crossed, jaw tight. His usual grin was gone, replaced by something harder. Worry mixed with faith. Luis Hernandez held rosary beads wrapped around his right hand. His lips moved in silent prayer, the same prayer his grandmother had taught him when he was 5 years old, the prayer for travelers, for people going into danger. Tommy Chen stood with a clipboard making last-minute notes. His hands were steady, but his eyes were red from 3 nights without sleep. He'd checked the wiring 17 times. It was perfect. But perfect didn't mean it would work. Sarah Hartley stood apart from the others, watching with an expression Jack couldn't quite read. Fear, maybe, or respect, or both. General Kenmore's Jeep pulled up. The tires crunched on gravel. The general climbed out, walked straight to Jack. His face was unreadable in the pre-dawn light. Major, I didn't authorize this test. No, sir. If this fails, I'll have to court-martial you. Yes, sir. Kenmore looked at the B-25. 8 gun barrels protruding from the nose. Crude welds visible even in the dim light. Lead bars visible through an open access panel in the tail. The whole thing looked like it had been assembled by madmen in a junkyard. It's the ugliest goddamn thing I've ever seen. Yes, sir. Fly it anyway. Jack did his walk around slowly, checking fuel lines with his calloused fingers. Control surfaces, gun mounts, every rivet, every weld, every bolt. This plane was held together by 4 men's skill and 1 man's desperation. He knew every piece of it, had touched every part during assembly, had dreamed about it for weeks. He climbed into the cockpit. The smell hit him first. Fresh metal, cordite still lingering from the ground test, and something else, the scent of possibility. The instruments looked normal. Altimeter, airspeed indicator, fuel gauge, manifold pressure. But there was one new addition, a simple button on the control yoke, wired to Tommy Chen's improvised firing system. Jack put his hand on it, felt the cold metal under his palm. "Margaret," he whispered, "this is for you." He fired up the engines. The twin Wright R2600 radials coughed, sputtered, then roared to life. 1,400 horsepower each, 2,800 total. The sound was different from a normal B-25. Deeper, angrier. The plane shook, the vibration traveling through the airframe into his seat, into his bones. It felt heavy, like a boxer who'd gained weight but kept his punch. Jack taxied to the end of the runway. Behind him, Duke's crew had gathered at the edge of the tarmac. Sarah stood in the control tower, binoculars raised. Kenmore's Jeep sat at the runway edge, the general watching through field glasses. In the next 90 seconds, one of two things would happen. Either Jack Brennan would prove that American ingenuity could overcome any obstacle, or he'd prove that some rules exist for good reasons. The engineers in California were watching their calculations. Jack was watching the jungle at the end of the runway. He pushed the throttles forward. The B-25 lurched forward, heavy and reluctant, like a bull being prodded into a ring. The airspeed indicator climbed. 20 miles per hour, 40, 60. The nose felt planted, glued to the earth. Walsh's telegram echoed in Jack's head. Aircraft will nose into ground, 80 miles per hour. The plane was eating up runway, fast, too fast. Jack could see individual trees at the far end now, palm fronds, vines, the wall of green that would kill him if this didn't work. 90 miles per hour, stall speed, the speed at which the wings should generate enough lift to fly. But the nose wasn't lifting. The nose wheel was still compressed, still rolling, still earthbound. Jack pulled back on the yoke, hard. The muscles in his forearms burned. His knuckles went white. The stick felt like it was made of concrete. 95 miles per hour. The jungle was getting closer. He could hear the engines screaming, could feel the airframe shaking. The whole plane felt like it wanted to tear itself apart. Duke Morrison, watching from the tarmac, stopped, breathing. His hands clenched into fists. Sarah Hartley whispered into the tower radio, "Come on, 100 miles per hour." Jack pulled the yoke into his chest, his whole body straining against physics, against gravity, against the expert in California who said this couldn't work. 400 feet to the trees, 300. 105 miles per hour. The nose wheel lifted. Not much, just 6 inches, a tiny gap between rubber and concrete. But it was enough. The aerodynamics changed. The center of pressure shifted. The main gear followed a second later. The B-25 clawed its way into the air, climbing at an angle so shallow it looked like it was crawling up an invisible hill. The engines howling, the airframe groaning, every rivet and weld straining under forces they weren't designed for. Jack cleared the first row of trees by 30 feet. He could see the leaves, could see a bird taking flight in panic, could see how close he'd come to dying. In the control tower, Sarah exhaled for the first time in 20 seconds. Her legs felt weak. She grabbed the edge of the console for support. On the tarmac, Duke Morrison laughed, a sound somewhere between relief and hysteria, like a man who just watched his brother walk across a tightrope over a canyon. Kenmore lowered his binoculars, said quietly to nobody in particular, "I'll be damned." At 2,000 feet, Jack leveled off and took stock. The plane flew. That was the good news. The controls responded. The engines ran smooth. The airframe held together. The bad news, it handled like a pregnant cow, sluggish on the controls. The extra weight in the nose made it want to pitch forward. He had to keep constant back pressure when on the yoke. His arms would be sore tomorrow, if there was a tomorrow. But it flew. Jack turned toward the ocean. Time for the real test. The reason he'd built this monster. The question that had haunted him since that first failed bombing mission in May. He keyed the radio. Tower Brennan, I'm going to test weapons systems. Estimate 15 minutes. Sarah's voice crackled back, her tone professional, but he could hear the relief underneath. Copy, Brennan. We'll be timing you. What happened next would answer the question that had haunted Jack since that first failed bombing mission in May. Could 850 caliber machine guns fired from a medium bomber actually do what he'd imagined? Or was this entire project an exercise in wishful thinking built on grief and rage? Jack flew 5 miles offshore. Below, the Coral Sea was choppy, dark blue under the morning clouds, whitecaps visible on the surface. The water looked cold and unforgiving. A bad place to ditch. He spotted his target, a piece of flotsam, a wooden crate about 4 feet square bobbing in the waves. During the war, the ocean was full of debris, pieces of ships, cargo containers, the detritus of combat. This would do. He came around in a wide arc, lined up his approach. The crate was small, maybe 200 yards ahead, growing larger in his windshield. He pushed the nose down slightly, descended to 300 feet, 200, 150. The ocean was close now, so close he could see individual waves, could see the spray kicked up by the wind, could feel the turbulence as the air bounced off the water. His thumb rested on the trigger button, 100 yards to target. He pressed. The world inside the cockpit became violence, not the rattle of individual guns, a sustained roar like an enormous piece of sailcloth being ripped down the middle. The entire airframe convulsed. Instruments blurred in his vision. The plane shuddered, the whole airframe vibrating with barely contained violence. The airspeed indicator dropped from 230 miles per hour to 215 in 2 seconds. The recoil was so strong it felt like flying into a headwind, like hitting an invisible wall. But the effect downrange was catastrophic. The water around the crate erupted into white chaos. Hundreds of rounds, each one capable of punching through an engine block, churning the ocean into a frenzy. The surface boiled. Geysers of water shot 20 feet into the air. The crate didn't break apart. It ceased to exist. 1 second it was there, solid, visible. The next, nothing but splinters and spray. Pieces of wood no bigger than toothpicks scattered across a 100-yard radius. Jack held the trigger for 3 seconds. In that time, approximately 1,200 rounds downrange, 1,200 pieces of copper-jacketed lead traveling at 2,900 feet per second. When he released, the sudden lack of noise felt like being underwater. The plane surged forward as the recoil stopped. Like a car when you take your foot off the brake. Jack's ears rang, high-pitched whine that blocked out everything else. The smell of burned powder was so thick it made him cough, made his eyes water. The cockpit was full of smoke and fumes. He looked at his trembling fingers. They were shaking. Not from fear, from the sudden understanding that everything had just changed. Jack keyed the radio, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Tower Brennan, weapons test successful. Returning to base, Sarah's voice came back. Define successful, the target no longer exists. A pause, then her voice carefully neutral. Copy that. As Jack turned back toward Port Moresby, his mind was racing. 8 guns, 1,200 rounds in 3 seconds. That much firepower could do more than destroy floating debris. It could suppress every anti-aircraft gun on a destroyer. It could clear the deck of a transport ship. It could give American bombers a fighting chance. But there was still one piece missing. He could strafe enemy ships. But how do you actually sink them with bombs when flying that low, high-altitude bombing didn't work? Low-altitude bombing had its own problems. Bombs dropped from 200 feet often passed clean through unarmored hulls and exploded in the water on the other side. Or worse, the blast would rise up and catch the plane that dropped it. The answer to that question would come from an unexpected source. A woman with a Berkeley engineering degree and a childhood memory of skipping stones on Lake Michigan. But first, Jack had to land this beast without killing himself. Bringing the modified B-25 down was harder than taking off. The heavy nose wanted to drop, wanted to fall. Jack had to fight it all the way to the runway, pulling back on the yoke with both hands, his shoulders burning, his forearms cramping. The wheels touched down hard, the nose strut compressed almost to the stops. For a terrifying second that felt like an hour, Jack thought it might collapse. Thought the whole front end would dig into the concrete and the plane would cartwheel. Fireball. End of story. But it held. The welds held. The steel held. Luis's craftsmanship held. Jack taxied to the hangar, killed the engines, sat in the sudden silence. His hands were still shaking. His heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. He took a deep breath, then another. Duke Morrison was the first one to the cockpit, running across the tarmac like his pants were on fire. "Sir, you okay?" Jack climbed out slowly. His legs felt like water, like he'd been running for hours. He grabbed the side of the cockpit to steady himself. "Did it work?" Duke asked. His eyes wide, hopeful. Jack looked at his crew. Duke, Luis, Tommy, Sarah walking across the tarmac from the tower. Her notebook clutched to her chest, her face unreadable. "It works. God help me, it actually works." Kenmore's Jeep pulled up. The general climbed out, walked straight to the B-25, stared at it for a long moment, ran his hand along the fuselage, touched one of the gun barrels, still warm from firing. "How many of these can you build, Major?" "As many as you need, sir. Start with 12. I want a squadron. This is what made America great, folks. Not committees, not studies, not waiting for permission. It was men like Jack Brennan and Duke Morrison building weapons in the dark with scrap metal and determination. It was women like Sarah Hartley using their brains when the world told them to stay quiet. That's the America I remember. That's the America we need to remember." July 20th, 1942. The hangar had transformed into a production line. Duke's crew was already starting work on the second B-25 conversion. The process was faster now. They had templates, measurements, a system. What had taken 6 weeks the first time would take 10 days the second. But Jack was stuck on a problem. The strafing worked. 8 50 caliber guns could suppress enemy defenses, could turn a ship's bridge into scrap metal, could clear the decks. But suppression didn't sink ships. Bombs sank ships. The problem was physics. At high altitude, bombs fell for 30 seconds or more, plenty of time for a ship to turn. But at low altitude, say 500 feet, the bomb barely had time to arm itself before hitting the water. And when bombs hit water, they sank. Sometimes they'd pass clean through an unarmored transport ship's hull and explode in the water on the other side. Sometimes they'd explode too close to the bomber that dropped them, destroying both ships. There had to be a better way. Sarah found Jack in the hangar that evening. He was staring at a diagram of bomb trajectory, pencil marks and eraser smudges covering the paper. Equations that didn't add up. Physics that didn't cooperate. Problem major. "We can strafe them, but we can't sink them." Sarah looked at the diagram, studied it with those engineers' eyes. Standard drop altitude, 200 to 500 feet. Approach angle level flight, 0 degrees. She was quiet for a moment, thinking, her mind working through the mathematics. Then her face changed, a memory surfacing. "When I was 8 years old, my brother and I used to skip stones on Lake Michigan. I could get 7 skips if the angle was right." Jack looked at her. "Stones. A 500-pound bomb is just a very heavy stone. What if instead of dropping it to sink, you dropped it to skip bombing?" Jack said the word slowly. "Testing them. The British tried it at low altitude. Too dangerous. The bombs bounced over the targets. Wrong angle. Wrong speed." Sarah grabbed a pencil, started sketching on the back of Jack's diagram. Think about it. A flat stone thrown hard at a 15-degree angle to the water. It doesn't sink. It bounces. She drew quickly, confidently. Bomber at 200 feet. Bomb released at 400 yards. First bounce at 200 yards. Second bounce at 50 yards. Then contact with the ship's hull above the waterline. The bomb punches through the thin hull plating. 5-second delayed fuse. By the time it explodes, it's deep inside the engine room or cargo hold. Jack stared at the diagram, his pulse quickening, the possibilities unfolding in his mind. "It's elementary physics," Sarah continued. "Velocity, angle of approach, surface tension. If you get the numbers right, the bomb doesn't sink. It skips. This is what happens when you let smart people solve problems instead of telling them what they can't do. Sarah Hartley wasn't supposed to be an engineer. Boeing rejected her because she was a woman. But here in a tin hangar in New Guinea, her brain was worth more than 100 factory engineers in California. That's America. That's real equality. Not quotas, but opportunity. The next morning, Jack, Sarah, and Duke stood on a dock in Port Moresby Harbor, looking at their target, the SS Pruth, a rusted steamer that had run aground years before. A derelict, a forgotten piece of maritime history. Now it would serve a new purpose. That's our practice target, Sarah said. We need to dial in the exact altitude, speed, and release point. Over the next 2 weeks, they ran 47 practice attempts, each one carefully measured, each one documented. Sarah stood on the dock with a stopwatch and binoculars, calculating, adjusting. The first 10 were disasters. Bombs skipped over the Pruth entirely, sailed past the rusted hull, and sank in deep water. Wasted ordnance, wasted time. 5 more sank before reaching the target. Wrong angle, wrong speed. The bombs hit the water nose first and dove like rocks. 7 hit too high. The fuses detonated in the air. Spectacular explosions that accomplished nothing. But run number 23 was perfect. Jack came in at 210 feet, exactly. Speed 230 miles per hour. Release point 400 yards from target. Everything by the numbers, everything precise. The 500-pound practice bomb filled with sand instead of explosives hit the water with a flat smack. Skipped once. Water spring. Skipped twice. Then slammed into the Pruth's hull with a sound like a church bell, a deep resonant clang that echoed across the harbor. It punched a hole 3 feet wide. If it had been a live bomb, the Pruth would have exploded from the inside, would have broken apart, would have sunk in minutes. Duke, watching from the dock, whispered, "We can do this. We can actually do this." Sarah made notes in her precise handwriting. Optimal parameters: 175 to 225 feet altitude, 220 to 240 miles per hour, 4 to 5 second delayed fuse, margin of error plus or minus 50 feet on altitude. Jack smiled for the first time in weeks. A real smile, not the grim determination that usually lived on his face. Now we just need to teach 12 pilots how to do it. Training 12 men to skip bomb at 200 feet while under enemy fire would be the easy part. The hard part would be proving it worked in combat. That opportunity would come on September 12, 1942, when Japanese intelligence made a fatal mistake. They assumed the Americans would keep fighting the same way they always had. August 1942. Jack trained his squadron relentlessly. 12 pilots, former bomber jockeys, most of them, men who'd been taught to fly high and safe, to trust the doctrine, to follow the manual. Now Jack was teaching them to fly suicidal. You go in at wave-top level, he'd say, standing in front of a blackboard covered in diagrams. So low the spray coats your windshield. You strafe the bridge, the gun positions, everything that moves. You suppress them until they can't shoot back. Then you skip your bomb into their hull and pray you clear the mast before it explodes. One pilot raised his hand, Lieutenant Peters, 22 years old, from Ohio, baby-faced, too young to be this far from home. "Sir, what if we don't clear the mast, then you die? Which is why you practice until you can do this in your sleep." They practiced every day. Morning runs, afternoon runs. The SS Pruth took so many practice hits, it started to look like Swiss cheese. The hull was perforated, dented, battered. By early September, all 12 pilots could hit the target 8 times out of 10. "They're ready," Duke told Jack. "No, they're not. But neither was I when I test flew that first plane." Sometimes ready enough has to be good enough. September 12, 1942. Intelligence brought news. A small Japanese convoy spotted off Gona. 1 destroyer, 2 transport ships. Not a major target, but a target nonetheless. General Kenmore called Jack into his office. The room smelled of cigars and stale coffee. Maps covered the walls. The weight of command visible in every line on Kenmore's face. "This is it, Major. Your first real test. You sink those ships, and I'll authorize 20 more conversions. You fail." Kenmore didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "We won't fail, sir. You're betting a lot on a tactic nobody's ever tried in combat. I'm betting on Americans, sir. We're pretty good at doing things nobody's ever done. The mission brief was simple. 3 modified B-25s. Jack would lead. Duke Morrison would fly his wing. A young captain named Reeves would fly the third. Go in low. Strafe first. Skip bomb second. Make it count. They flew out at dawn. The Coral Sea was calm, almost glassy, perfect conditions for skip bombing. Smooth water meant predictable bounces. Jack spotted the convoy at 8:47 a.m. 3 ships, just like intelligence said. The destroyer in the lead, 2 transports following in a loose formation. They were making maybe 12 knots. Confident, unhurried. They'd been sailing these waters for months without serious opposition. All aircraft, this is Brennan. We go in on my mark. Stay low, stay fast. Suppressive fire first. Questions negative, sir. Then let's go to work. Jack pushed the nose down. The altimeter unwound. 1,000 feet. 500. 300. 200. At 150 feet, he leveled off. The ocean was so close he could see individual waves, could see fish jumping, could see his own shadow racing across the water. The Japanese destroyer was growing in his windshield. He saw the lookouts pointing, tiny figures on the deck. The ship's anti-aircraft guns started to traverse, tracking him. But too slow, the geometry was all wrong. The guns were designed to track targets moving across the sky, not targets charging head-on like a bull. At 1,000 yards, Jack pressed the trigger. The 850 calibers erupted. The sustained thunder filled the cockpit, the smell immediate and overpowering. The ocean surface between Jack and the destroyer turned white with impacts. Hundreds of rounds walking toward the target. Then the tracers found steel. The destroyer's bridge, unarmored glass and thin plating shattered. Jack could see it happening, could see the windows exploding, could see figures falling. The officers inside cut down by the storm of lead. The anti-aircraft crews on the open deck were exposed. They vanished, not killed cleanly, obliterated, swept away by the sheer volume of fire. Jack held the trigger for 5 seconds. 1,000 rounds downrange. The suppression was total, complete. The destroyer didn't fire a single shot in return. Couldn't. There was nobody left alive on deck to pull the triggers. Jack roared over the ship at 230 miles per hour. So low his slipstream kicked up spray from the destroyer's bow wake. So low he could see details. Rust on the hull, paint peeling, a lifeboat hanging from davits. Behind him, Duke and Reeves made their runs on the transports. The sound of their guns was like thunder rolling across the ocean, like a summer storm contained in steel tubes. Jack came around for his second pass, this time targeting the first transport, a fat cargo ship, probably carrying troops or supplies. Maybe both. It sat low in the water, heavy with its cargo, altitude 200 feet, speed 232 miles per hour, distance 450 yards. He released. The 500-pound bomb separated from the belly of the B-25. It fell 20 feet in a shallow arc, hit the water with a flat smack, skipped once, a clean bounce, water spraying in a white plume, skipped twice, then slammed into the transport's hull just above the waterline. The impact sound was audible even over the engine noise, a deep metallic thud that Jack felt through the airframe of his plane. He pulled up hard, clearing the ship's mast by less than 15 feet. So close he could see the Japanese flag, could see sailors on deck looking up in terror. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The explosion gutted the transport from the inside out. The whole midsection of the ship simply disappeared, replaced by fire and steam and flying debris. The ship's back broke. The bow and stern section tilted upward. Water rushed in through the massive hole. Men poured out, jumping into the ocean, some on fire, some already dead. Duke's bomb hit the second transport amidships. Same result. Catastrophic. Immediate. The ship listed heavily, started to sink, lifeboats being lowered, men abandoning ship. The ocean filling with survivors and bodies. The destroyer, leaderless and burning from the strafing run, tried to maneuver, tried to bring its guns to bear. Too late. Reeves's skip bomb caught it in the engine room. The ship shuddered, stopped, dead in the water. 15 minutes after the first shot, all three Japanese ships were sinking or dead in the water. Zero American losses, zero damage to the attacking aircraft. On the flight back, Jack's hands were steady on the controls. No shaking this time. But he didn't feel triumphant. He felt tired. They'd just killed hundreds of men. Necessary, yes. The ships had been carrying supplies and reinforcements to enemy positions. Good number of war is never good. Duke's voice crackled over the radio. Sir, did that actually work? Yes, Duke? It worked. When they landed, the ground crews were cheering, running across the tarmac, waving their caps. The news had preceded them. Radio reports, 3 ships sunk, new tactic, complete success. Kenmore was waiting by Jack's plane. His face split in a rare grin. Confirmed kills. 3 for 3, sir. I'm authorizing 30 conversions. We're calling them commerce destroyers. And Major Brennan, sir, that's the damnedest piece of flying I've ever seen. You just changed this war. News of the attack reached Tokyo by evening, but the Japanese high command couldn't believe the reports. Medium bombers engaging destroyers in a gunfight, impossible. Skip bombing, unheard of. They assumed it was a lucky torpedo strike, a submarine that had somehow gone undetected. They had no idea that Jack Brennan had just made their entire naval doctrine obsolete, and they were about to pay for that ignorance with the largest convoy they'd ever assembled. Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Nakamura sat in the intelligence office at Rabaul, reading the report from the Gona convoy. The paper felt thin in his hands, cheap wartime stock. But the words on it were heavy. 3 ships lost. The survivors reported bombers flying at mast height. One sailor, his face bandaged and his hands shaking, claimed to have seen 100 machine guns firing from a single plane. His eyes had the look of a man who'd seen something that broke his understanding of the world. Nakamura's superior, Admiral Yamada, dismissed it with a wave of his hand. Exaggeration. Fear. The Americans used torpedo bombers. The men are embarrassed they didn't see them coming. Sir, with respect, multiple witnesses reported the same details. The altitude, the gunfire, the skip bombing technique. Enough. The Americans bomb from high altitude. It's all they know how to do. This changes nothing. But Nakamura wasn't convinced. He'd been a mathematics teacher before the war, at a small school in Yokohama. He taught geometry to boys who dreamed of becoming engineers. He understood patterns, and this pattern was new, different, dangerous. That evening, he wrote a letter to his wife, Keiko. The pen felt strange in his hand after months of holding nothing but military reports and navigation charts. His son Takeshi had been 6 years old when Nakamura last saw him. That spring morning in Ueno Park, cherry blossoms falling like snow. The memory felt like something from another life. My dearest, I fear the Americans have learned something we have not. The official reports say otherwise, but I trust the eyes of frightened men more than the certainty of comfortable admirals. If I am right, the war has changed. If I am wrong, I will see you in the spring. Either way, know that I love you and our son more than words can express. Tell Takeshi his father thinks of him every day. He sealed the letter but didn't send it. Not yet. There would be time later. Or there wouldn't. Either way, the letter existed. His feelings were recorded. That would have to be enough. October 1942, Japanese Imperial Headquarters approved Operation 81, a massive reinforcement convoy to New Guinea. 8 destroyers, 8 transport ships, 6,912 troops, 6 months of supplies, ammunition, food, medical supplies, everything needed to retake the island and push the Americans back into the sea. It would be the largest Japanese convoy in the South Pacific, and it would sail in daylight protected by a defensive formation so tight that American torpedoes couldn't penetrate it. American high-altitude bombers couldn't hit it. The plan was textbook, perfect on paper. Admiral Masatomi Kimura, commander of the convoy, was confident. Standing in the operations room, he pointed at the map with a wooden pointer. The Americans haven't sunk a single major convoy this year. They will bomb from high altitude. We will evade. It's a pattern that hasn't failed. Nakamura, assigned to the flagship destroyer Shirayuki, kept his doubts to himself. In the Imperial Navy, you didn't question admirals. You didn't voice concerns that contradicted the official narrative. You nodded, you obeyed, you hoped you were wrong. The convoy was scheduled to depart February 28, 1943. Estimated arrival at March 4th. 4 days of sailing, 4 days of exposure, 4 days of hoping the Americans would fight the way they'd always fought. What neither Kimura nor Nakamura knew was that at Port Moresby, Jack Brennan's team had just finished converting the 24th B-25 to a commerce destroyer. Sarah Hartley had written a training manual. Precise, technical, everything learned from 47 practice runs condensed into 50 pages. Duke Morrison had trained new crews. Tommy Chen had refined the firing circuits, made them more reliable, more efficient, and Jack Brennan, he was teaching pilots a new tactic, attack in waves, B-17s from high altitude to draw fire and force the convoy to maneuver, then commerce destroyers at wave-top level to slaughter them while they were distracted. Looking up instead of forward, the Japanese were bringing an army to a knife fight. They didn't know the Americans had brought a machine gun. The harbor at Rabaul was a forest of masts and smokestacks. 16 ships, the largest convoy Lieutenant Commander Nakamura had ever seen. More steel than he'd thought existed in the entire Pacific theater. He stood on the bridge of the destroyer Shirayuki watching troops board the transports. Young men, most of them. Farm boys from Kyushu who'd never seen the ocean before joining the Navy. Students from Tokyo who should have been in university. They sang as they marched up the gangplanks. Patriotic songs, confident in Japanese superiority, confident in inevitable victory. Nakamura watched and said nothing. What could he say? That he had a bad feeling, that the mathematics troubled him, that the Americans might have learned something new. Admiral Kimura stood beside him, chest puffed with pride, medals gleaming on his uniform. Look at them, Nakamura. These men will retake New Guinea. The Americans can't stop this. They haven't stopped any convoy in 6 months. Sir, the reports from Gona suggest we're exaggerated. Fear makes men see things that aren't there. We've been over this. Nakamura wanted to argue, wanted to show the Admiral his calculations, the probability matrices he'd worked out in his cabin. But you don't argue with admirals, especially not admirals who'd already made up their minds. So he nodded, accepted the dismissal, watched the troops board. That night before the convoy sailed, Nakamura finished his letter to Keiko, added a final paragraph by candlelight in his small cabin. Tomorrow we sail with 8,000 souls. The Admiral is confident. The men are eager. I am uncertain. I think of you and Takeshi constantly. Tell him I am doing my duty as all men must. Tell him that even when we must do difficult things, we do them with honor. The mathematics of this war trouble me. The Americans have more factories, more steel, more oil. But we have courage and discipline. I hope that is enough. If something happens, know that my last thought will be of you holding Takeshi that spring morning in Ueno Park when the cherry blossoms fell like snow. He sealed it. This time he sent it, gave it to the mail clerk with instructions to post it immediately. For the convoy sailed. For whatever was going to happen, happened. March 1st, 1943. The convoy left Rabaul in perfect formation. 8 destroyers in a protective ring, like the petals of a flower. 8 transports in the center, the core. The reason for everything. They cut through the water at 12 knots. Not fast, but steady, confident. For 2 days they sailed under cover of a tropical storm. Rain so thick you couldn't see 200 yards. Perfect weather for avoiding American air patrols. The kind of weather that made reconnaissance impossible. That grounded scout planes. That reduced visibility to almost nothing. On the bridge of Shirayuki, Admiral Kimura smiled. Even the gods favor this mission. Nakamura checked the meteorology reports. The storm would clear on March 3rd. Just as they entered the Vitia Strait, they would be exposed, vulnerable, sitting ducks if the Americans had learned new tricks. He said nothing. What was there to say? The course was set. The plans were made. The convoy was already at sea. While Nakamura worried about American bombers, Jack Brennan wasn't worried at all. He was ready. 24 commerce destroyers, pilots trained to perfection. Every man had run this course at least 30 times, had skip-bombed the Pruth until they could do it blindfolded, and a battle plan that would either prove his theory or end his career. March 2nd, 1943, 6 p.m. Sarah Hartley burst into the operations room with a manila folder. Her hands were shaking. Not from fear, from excitement, from the sudden understanding that everything they'd built was about to be tested on the largest scale imaginable. General Kenmore, Major Brennan, you need to see this. She spread reconnaissance photos on the table. Black and white, grainy, shot from high altitude through breaks in the clouds, but unmistakable. 16 ships in formation, like a textbook diagram. Perfect spacing, perfect geometry. Jack leaned over the photos, counted, recounted, his finger tracing from ship to ship. 8 destroyers, 8 transports. He did the math in his head. 7,000 troops, maybe more. Enough supplies for 6 months. Kenmore whistled low. A sound of appreciation and dread. Biggest convoy we've seen. Biggest target we've seen, Jack corrected. Sarah pointed to the weather reports. Clip to the folder. Storms clearing tomorrow morning. If they maintain course and speed, they'll be in the Vitiaz Strait by 10 a.m. March 3rd. Clear skies. Nowhere to hide. Duke Morrison, listening from the doorway, said quietly, "This is it, isn't it? This is the one we've been building for." Jack nodded. This is the one. March 3rd, 1943, 5 a.m. The briefing room was packed. 24 B-25 Commerce destroyer pilots, 8 A-20 Havoc crews, 12 P-38 fighter pilots, and the B-17 high-altitude bomber crews who'd serve as bait, men standing shoulder to shoulder. The room smelling of coffee and nervous sweat and aviation fuel. Jack stood at the front, pointer in hand, facing a large map of the Bismarck Sea, red marks showing the convoy's projected position, blue marks showing the attack approach. Gentlemen, we're going to hit the largest Japanese convoy ever assembled in this theater. 16 ships, 7,000 enemy troops. If we don't stop them, they retake New Guinea, and this war goes on another year. Maybe longer. He let that sink in, watched the faces, saw the weight of it settling on young shoulders. The B-17s go in first. High altitude, 7,000 feet. You're the bait. Make them look up. Make them think it's a standard bombing run. Make them confident. The B-17 pilots nodded. They'd done this before. Been the distraction. The misdirection. While they're watching the sky, we come in at wave-top level. 12 Commerce destroyers in line abreast. We strafe every ship, suppress their guns, then we skip-bomb them while they're blind and bleeding. Lieutenant Peters raised his hand, the young pilot from Ohio, still baby-faced despite months of combat. "Sir, 16 ships, that's a lot of anti-aircraft fire." "It is, until we silence it." The strafing runs are critical. 8 50 calibers per plane, 12 plane. That's 96 heavy machine guns firing simultaneously. They won't have time to aim. They won't have time to think. They'll be too busy dying. The room was silent, the weight of what they were about to do settling like fog. "I won't lie to you, this is dangerous. Some of us might not come back. But if we do this right, we end their offensive capability in this theater. We save lives, American lives, Allied lives, and we prove that courage and innovation beat doctrine every time." He paused, looked at each face. These were his men now, his responsibility. Questions, nobody spoke. "Then gear up. We fly in 1 hour. This is what the greatest generation understood, folks. Sometimes you have to look death in the eye and do the job anyway. Not because you want to, because it's necessary, because someone has to. That's not bravado. That's duty. That's what made America the greatest nation on earth." After the briefing, Sarah found Jack checking his plane, running his hands over the gun mounts, the welds, the patches where bullets had been repaired from previous missions. His ritual, his meditation. Jack. It was the first time she'd called him by his first name outside of that night in the hangar. He turned. "Be careful. Always am. No, you're not. You're reckless and brilliant, and you take risks that should get you killed." Jack smiled, a tired smile. "But they haven't yet." Sarah handed him a piece of paper, folded once, her handwriting visible through the thin paper. "Updated approach vectors. Winds shifting from the northeast. Adjust your skip bomb release point by 50 yards. Thanks." She hesitated, standing there into the pre-dawn darkness, the sound of engines warming up in the background. "When you get back, there's something I need to tell you. Tell me now, no, when you get back. Incentive to survive." Jack looked at her for a long moment, her face serious. eyes reflecting the hangar lights. "I'll be back." "You better be." At 9:47 a.m., 24 commerce destroyers took off from Port Moresby. By 11 a.m., the Japanese convoy would be a burning graveyard. But the battle would extract a price, and that price would haunt Jack Brennan for the rest of his life. 10 a.m. The B-17s appeared at 7,000 feet. Right on schedule, perfectly timed. The drone of their engines audible even over the ocean wind. On the bridge of Shirayuki, the lookout screamed. Aircraft high altitude bearing 040. Admiral Kimura grabbed his binoculars. The leather strap worn smooth from years of use. Anti-aircraft batteries prepared to engage. The 8 destroyers' anti-aircraft guns elevated, tracking the B-17s. Hydraulics whining. Gun crews scrambling to their positions. On the transports, gunners ran to their stations. The dance they'd practiced 100 times. Nakamura watched the sky. Standard American tactics. High altitude. Precision bombing that never hit anything. The pattern he'd seen in every report, every engagement, every wasted American sortie. The bomb bay doors open, black specks tumbled out, growing larger, falling. Evasive maneuvers, Kimura ordered. The destroyers turned hard. White wakes carved zigzags in the blue water. The transports, slower and heavier, began their turns. Ponderous, like whales changing direction. The bombs fell. Near misses, geysers of water erupting 200 yards from the convoy. 300, the ocean heaving with impacts. But no hits, not even close. Nakamura allowed himself a small breath of relief, the same pattern. The Americans learning nothing. "They still haven't learned," Kimura said triumphantly, his voice loud with confidence. Then the lookout screamed again, a different tone this time. Not confidence, terror. Contacts low altitude, multiple contacts. From the haze on the western horizon, 12 B-25s appeared, not at bombing altitude. At wave top level, 500 feet, 400, 300, dropping lower. Lower than should be possible, lower than made sense. Nakamura felt his stomach drop, his mathematical mind understanding before his conscious thoughts caught up. No, the reports were true. "What are they doing?" Kimura demanded. "Those aren't torpedo bombers, sir. I don't know." The B-25 spread into a line a mile wide, 12 aircraft, side by side, sweeping toward the convoy at 230 miles per hour. Like a wall, like judgment. On the destroyer Arashio, the gunnery officer tried to depress his 25mm cannons, but they were designed to track aircraft in the sky, not aircraft charging head-on like bulls. The geometry was wrong, the angles impossible. 1,000 yards. The Japanese gunners opened fire, tracers arcing out. Too late, too slow, too poorly aimed. At 800 yards, the commerce destroyers opened fire. The sound was biblical, apocalyptic. 96 50 caliber machine guns firing simultaneously. The combined rate of fire over 60,000 rounds per minute. The air between the planes and the convoy turned white with tracers and impacts. The ocean surface churned, boiled. Then the bullets found steel. Nakamura, standing on Shirayuki's bridge, watched the windows explode inward. Glass and metal fragments filled the air like a swarm of angry bees. Deadly bees. The officer next to him, Lieutenant Sato, a good man, father of 3 children, was cut in half by a stream of rounds. His body separated at the waist. Blood everywhere. The instrument panel shattered. Gauges exploding. Brass and glass and plastic. The helm was destroyed. The wheel spinning free. No one to control it. No one alive to treat them. Admiral Kimura opened his mouth to give an order. A 50 caliber round entered through his left temple, exited through his right ear. He was dead before he hit the deck, before his brain registered the impact. Nakamura dropped flat, his face pressed against the deck. Above him, the steel structure of the bridge groaned as hundreds of bullets punched through, the sound like hail on a tin roof, but hail made of death. Outside, the anti-aircraft crews were simply gone, swept away. The deck looked like it had been hosed down with a pressure washer, but instead of water, it was lead and copper, blood running in the scuppers, bodies scattered like broken dolls. Jack Brennan, in the lead commerce destroyer, held his trigger down for 7 seconds. 2,000 rounds. The destroyer's bridge was a smoking ruin. the superstructure perforated, unrecognizable. He pulled up, clearing the mast by 20 feet, could see the damage, could see what he'd done. Keyed the radio, all aircraft commenced skip bombing runs. Go, 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 war is not glory, folks. War is horror made necessary by evil. Jack Brennan wasn't proud of what he was doing. But he knew that every ship he sank was one less ship carrying supplies to the people holding his family. Sometimes the right thing and the easy thing are not the same thing. The transports were slow, fat, packed with thousands of soldiers who had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, trapped on steel boxes in the middle of the ocean. Duke Morrison lined up on the first transport, altitude 200 feet, speed 235 miles per hour. Through the chaos of smoke and spray, he could see Japanese soldiers on the deck, firing rifles upward, useless, desperate, brave and futile. He released his bomb at 400 yards. The 500-pound cylinder separated, fell, hit the water, skipped once, twice, slammed into the hull just above the waterline, punched through the thin steel plating like it was paper. Duke pulled up so hard he grayed out for a second, vision tunneling, blood draining from his head. Behind him, the delayed fuse counted down. 5, 4, 3. The explosion gutted the transport from the inside. The entire midship section simply disappeared, replaced by fire and steam and flying debris. Metal twisted into impossible shapes. The bow and stern folded upward like a closing book. The ship sank in 4 minutes, taking most of the soldiers with it, hundreds of men, gone. One by one, the commerce destroyers made their runs. Systematic, methodical, efficient, like a factory, like an assembly line of destruction. Transport number 2 hit amidships, fuel drums on deck ignited. The entire ship became a floating inferno. Men jumping into the ocean on fire, their screams audible even over the engine noise. Transport number 3, direct hit on the cargo hold. The ship broke in half so fast it looked like it had been cut with a saw. A giant invisible blade. Both halves sinking immediately. No time for lifeboats. No time for anything. Destroyer Erashio, already dead in the water from the strafing run. Morrison's wingman put a skip bomb into its engine room. It listed heavily, then capsized. The hull visible, barnacles and rust, then gone beneath the waves. Destroyer Tokitsukaze took 2 hits. The first broke its back, the keel snapping. The second was unnecessary. The ship was already sinking, already finished. Nakamura found himself in the ocean. He didn't remember jumping, didn't remember the moment of decision. 1 second he was on the bridge, the next in the water. The transition lost to shock and adrenaline. The water was warm, thick with oil, the smell overpowering, diesel and seawater and blood. Around him, hundreds of men struggled, some screaming, some silent, some already dead, floating face down, the ocean claiming them. He watched Shirayuki, his ship, his home for 6 months, roll onto its side. The rising sun flag on the stern disappeared beneath the waves. The ship that had seemed so solid, so permanent, gone in minutes. Above, the American bombers circled like sharks, like predators that smelled blood in the water. The sound of their engines, a constant drone, a reminder of who controlled the sky, who controlled everything. Nakamura thought of Keiko, of Takeshi, of the letter he'd sent, hoped it would reach them, hoped they would know he'd been thinking of them at the end. I was right, he thought bitterly. The war has changed, and we didn't change with it. A piece of debris floated past, part of a lifeboat. He grabbed it, not to survive, just to have something to hold on to, something solid in a world that had dissolved into chaos. Lieutenant Peters, the 22-year-old from Ohio, made his run on a transport. Perfect approach, perfect release, everything by the numbers, everything Sarah had taught them. Then his left engine coughed. Once, twice, a sound like a person clearing their throat. But wrong, mechanical, deadly. Engine fire, his co-pilot screamed, pointing at the gauges. Oil pressure dropping, temperature rising. Peter's skip bomb hit true, the transport exploded. Mission accomplished. But Peter's plane was trailing smoke. Losing altitude, the left engine dead, windmilling, creating drag. "We're not gonna make it back," the co-pilot yelled, his voice high with fear. "Like hell we're not." Peters feathered the dead engine. The B-25 shuddered, dropped to 300 feet, then 100. Ditch it now." Peters aimed for a clear patch of ocean, 5 miles from the burning convoy, far enough to be safe from secondary explosions, from sinking ships. The plane hit the water hard, nose crumpled, tail snapped off, but it floated, the watertight compartments doing their job. Peters and his crew climbed out onto the wing. 4 men, all alive, all breathing, wet and scared, but alive. "PT boats are on the way," the radio operator said, holding the waterproof emergency radio above his head. 15 minutes, they were rescued 40 minutes later. All 4 survived, picked up by a patrol boat that had been shadowing the attack, waiting for exactly this moment. That's American engineering, folks. Even when everything goes wrong and we build things that give our boys a fighting chance. Peters flew a damaged plane 5 miles on one engine, ditched it perfectly, and saved his whole crew. That's training. That's skill. That's American. Jack counted his planes as they formed up for the return flight, circling above the burning convoy, above the oil slicks and debris and bodies. 1, 2, 3, 11. 11 commerce destroyers, 1 missing. All aircraft sound off. One by one they checked in. Morrison, Reeves, Chen, the others, their voices crackling over the radio. Tired, but alive. Then, "Brennan, this is Peters. We're in the water, but we're okay. PT boats en route." Jack closed his eyes for a moment, relief washing over him. "Copy, Peters. Good flying." The flight back to Port Moresby took 43 minutes. Jack flew on autopilot, his mind elsewhere, on the destroyer's bridge, on the officers cut down, on the gunners swept from the decks, on the transport ships full of soldiers, sinking, drowning. 12 transports sunk or sinking, 4 destroyers sunk, 3,000 Japanese troops killed, maybe more. The numbers would be refined later, confirmed by intelligence. But the rough count was clear. It was the most one-sided air-sea victory in history. But all Jack could think about was the faces, the men like him, fathers, sons, husbands, doing their duty, following orders, dying because their leaders had refused to believe the Americans could learn, could adapt, could innovate. Port Moresby was chaos. Ground crews cheering, running across the tarmac, pilots swarming the returning planes, slapping each other on the back. The euphoria of victory, of survival. Jack landed, taxied to his revetment, killed the engines, sat in the silence, his hands finally shaking. The adrenaline wearing off, the reality settling in. Duke Morrison was already out of his plane, grinning like a madman. "Sir, we did it. We actually did it." Jack climbed down slowly, his legs unsteady, looked at his plane. 37 bullet holes. The gun barrels burnt blue from firing. The right wingtip had a piece of Japanese antenna embedded in the leading edge. Evidence. Proof of how close he'd come. Sarah ran across the tarmac, her notebook forgotten, her professional demeanor cracking. Jack Peters radioed, "He's safe, they're all safe." "I know." She looked at him, really looked. Past the uniform, past the rank, seeing the man underneath. "Are you okay? I don't know." Kenmore's Jeep pulled up. The general climbed out, face split in a grin. "Brennan, preliminary reports say 12 transports, 4 destroyers. Biggest air victory in Pacific history." "Yes, sir." "You should be celebrating." "Yes, sir." Kenmore's smile faded. He'd been in the First War, had seen that look before. On other men's faces. The look of someone who'd done what needed doing and would carry it forever. "Go get some sleep, Major. That's an order." "Yes, sir." March 5th, 1943, Imperial Headquarters, Tokyo. The report sat on the conference table like a dead thing, like something that had crawled out of a nightmare and died there. Operation 81. Total failure. 16 ships lost. 3,064 confirmed dead. 2,890 missing, presumed dead. 0 supplies delivered to Leh. The admiral sat in silence. The kind of silence that follows catastrophe. That follows the moment when everything you believed turns out to be wrong. Finally, one spoke, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. How? How did medium bombers sink destroyers? Another admiral read from a survivor's report, his hands shaking slightly. They flew at mast height. They had cannons in the nose. Hundreds of cannons. We couldn't fight back. Exaggeration, 8 survivors report the same thing. Different ships, different times, same details. More silence. Longer this time. Heavy with implications. The decision was unanimous. Never send another large convoy in daylight. From now on, submarines and night barges only. Small shipments, hidden movements. The Americans had severed Japan's supply line to New Guinea, had cut the artery. The war in the South Pacific had fundamentally changed. The news reached Washington within hours. The War Department issued commendations. Medals were promised. Promotions discussed. But the real change happened at North American Aviation's factory in Kansas City. To Theodore Walsh, the engineer who'd sent the angry telegram calling Jack's modifications catastrophic, sat in his office reading the combat reports. His coffee growing cold, his cigar forgotten in the ashtray. 12 transports, 4 destroyers, 1 American plane damaged. Crew survived. He picked up the phone. Get me the production manager. We're retooling the assembly line. Sir, the B-25J model. Solid nose. 8 50 caliber guns, factory installed, reinforced floor, balance weights. Everything Major Brennan did in that hangar in New Guinea we're going to do here. We're building 1,000 of them. Yes, sir. Walsh hung up, pulled out company letterhead, wrote in his careful engineer's hand. Major Brennan, you were right. I was wrong. Congratulations on your victory. The B-25J goes into production next month. Every plane will carry your legacy. Walsh, he sealed it, sent it, then sat back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the difference between theory and practice, between what should work and what does work. That's American humility, folks. Walsh was a brilliant engineer, but he was man enough to admit when he was wrong. He didn't make excuses, didn't blame Brennan for ignoring his advice. He just fixed the problem and moved forward. That's how we won the war. Not by being perfect, by being adaptable. Jack kept flying, kept modifying. The B-25H model. He mounted a 75mm cannon in the nose, a literal artillery piece, the kind you'd find on a tank. The recoil was so strong it slowed the plane by 40 miles per hour when fired, made it shudder like a bang shaking off water. But it could sink a cruiser with one hit, could punch through armor plating, could reach out and touch targets at ranges that seemed impossible. The missions blurred together. Wewak, Rabaul, the Philippines. 89 combat missions over 2 years. 47 confirmed ship kills, each one recorded in his notebook. Each one a tick mark. Each one bringing him closer to his family. August 1944. Sarah was rotated stateside, promoted to lead engineer at North American Aviation, the first woman to hold that position. She'd earned it, had revolutionized their approach to field modifications, had saved countless lives with her calculations. Before she left, she found Jack working on a plane, always working, always tinkering, always trying to make it better, safer, more lethal. I'm leaving tomorrow, I know. That thing I said, before the Bismarck Sea battle, I never told you. Tell me now. She was quiet for a moment, choosing her words. I think you're the bravest man I've ever met. Not because you fly into danger, because you carry guilt that isn't yours to carry, and you keep going anyway. Jack didn't know what to say, kept his hands on the wrench, on the familiar work. Your family's alive, Jack. Intelligence confirmed it. Santo Tomas camp. They're alive. Jack's hands stopped moving. How long have you known? 2 months. I didn't tell you because I wanted you to keep flying angry. But now it's almost over. And I want you to fly home. Understand? Yes. She kissed him on the cheek, quickly, like it was something she'd been wanting to do for a long time. Go get them. February 3rd, 1945. The 1st Cavalry Division smashed through the gates of Santo Tomas internment camp. Tanks rolling, soldiers cheering. 3,700 prisoners, skeletal, sick, traumatized, but alive. Jack landed in Manila 3 hours later, the city still burning, smoke rising from 100 fires, the smell of cordite and destruction. He didn't wait for transport, just started running. The camp was chaos, prisoners hugging soldiers, crying, laughing, the sound of liberation, of freedom regained. Jack ran through the crowd, shouting, "Brennan, Margaret, Brennan, Emma." Robert, then he heard it, a voice he'd heard in his nightmares for 3 years. But real now, not a dream. Daddy Emma, 17 now, thin as a rail, her face gaunt, her eyes too old. But alive, breathing, real, behind her Margaret, 89 pounds, gray hair where there'd been brown, lines in her face that hadn't been there. But her eyes were the same, still recognized him, still knew him. The children Robert, Catherine, James stared at him like he was a ghost, like he was something from another world. Robert was 14 now, Catherine 11, James 8. They barely recognized him. He'd been gone too long, changed too much. Jack dropped to his knees, put his arms around all of them, pulled them close, felt their bones through their clothes, felt their hearts beating. Live, live, live. "I'm here. I'm here. I've got you," Margaret whispered, her voice hoarse from malnutrition. "We knew you'd come. We heard the planes. I knew." Jack flew his last combat mission on August 10th, 1945, 5 days after Hiroshima. The world was changing. The war was ending. But there were still targets, still missions. A skip bombing run on harbor installations at Formosa. By the book, perfect execution. No drama, just professionalism. Just doing the job one last time. When he landed, he walked to his plane, put his hand on the nose. The metal still warm from the engines, from the friction of flight. "We're done," he whispered. He never flew combat again. 1946. Jack returned to the Philippines. Manila Air Services, rebuilt from ash, from ruins, starting over in a city that had been destroyed and was slowly healing. Margaret recovered slowly, physically. The weight came back, the strength, but the nightmares didn't stop. The children less so. Emma became a pilot, following in her father's footsteps. Robert struggled with nightmares of his own. The camp, the hunger, the fear. Catherine and James were too young to remember much, but the trauma was there. Buried, waiting. Jack flew cargo routes. Peaceful flights, no guns, no bombs, just honest work, moving people and goods between islands. But at night, he still dreamed of the Bismarck Sea, still saw the destroyer's bridge exploding, still heard the screams. The B-25J Commerce destroyer became standard, 4,318 built, flying in every theater, proving Jack's concept over and over. D-130 gunships, direct descendants, same philosophy. Overwhelming firepower from a bomber. A-10 Warthog, spiritual grandchild, fly low, hit hard, come home. Sarah Hartley became Vice President of Engineering at North American Aviation. First woman in that position. She never married. When asked why, she'd smile. "I already gave my heart to the work, and to one stubborn mechanic in New Guinea," but she never said that part out loud. Duke Morrison opened an aircraft repair shop in Texas, trained a generation of mechanics, taught them the same lesson Jack had taught him. The manual is a guide, not a law. Tommy Chen became an electrical engineering professor at MIT, published papers on firing circuits, on synchronized weapon systems, never mentioning where he'd learned it, never taking credit that belonged to someone else. Hiroshi Nakamura was rescued by submarine I-17 after 6 hours in the water, spent the rest of the war in a hospital ship, then as a logistics officer, far from combat, far from the ocean. After the war, he returned to teaching mathematics at a school in Yokohama. The same school, the same classroom, teaching boys who'd never known war, who'd never had to. His son Takeshi was 9 years old when Nakamura returned home in 1946, the boy who'd been 6 when his father left. Now almost unrecognizable, taller, different. In 1952, Nakamura received a letter, American postmark, Manila return address. His hands shook as he opened it. Takeshi, now 15, watched his father read, saw tears form in the old man's eyes. Commander Nakamura, I learned your name from post-war records. I wanted you to know that I carry the weight of Bismarck's sea every day. I do not ask forgiveness, but I want you to know I took no pleasure in what I did. I did what war demanded, as did you. I hope you found your family well. Major Jack Brennan retired, Nakamura wrote back, his English careful but clear. Major Brennan, my family survived. My son is now 15. I teach him that honor is not victory, but doing one's duty with integrity. You did yours, I did mine. The war is over. Let us leave it there. Hiroshi Nakamura. They never met, but they understood each other. October 16, 1957. Jack was flying a routine cargo run. Beechcraft C-45. Manila to Mindanao. Cargo of medical supplies and mail. Nothing special, nothing dangerous. A tropical thunderstorm came out of nowhere, the kind that appears in minutes, that turns the sky black and the rain horizontal. Radio call at 3:47 p.m. Manila Tower Brennan, encountering severe turbulence, descending to 8,000. Static. The wreckage was found 3 days later, deep in the jungle. The plane had hit a mountain. Jack Brennan, 57 years old, killed instantly. The man who'd survived 89 combat missions, who'd faced down zeros in flak and impossible odds, killed by weather and bad luck. The funeral was held at Arlington National Cemetery, full military honors. Margaret, 73 years old, stood with her 4 children, 7 grandchildren. Emma was now 30. Robert, 27. Catherine, 24. James, 21. All adults, all carrying pieces of their father in different ways. Sarah flew in from California, Duke from Texas, Tommy from Boston. 3 B-25Js flew missing man formation, the sound of their engines echoing across the cemetery. The commanding general spoke. Jack Brennan saved thousands of lives by revolutionizing air warfare. His legacy flies in every gunship, every close support aircraft, every time an American pilot gets close enough to look the enemy in the eye. But Emma Brennan, now a captain in the Air Force, said it better in her eulogy, her voice steady despite the tears. My father was not a perfect man. He carried demons from the war, nightmares he never talked about. But he taught me that sometimes the only way to protect what you love is to become dangerous to those who threaten it. That's not violence, that's love in its most desperate form. Margaret stood beside the grave, silent, her hand on the folded flag. She would live another 12 years, dying peacefully in 1969, surrounded by children and grandchildren, never remarrying, never forgetting the man who'd built a weapon to bring her home. Present day, National Air and Space Museum. Washington, D.C. A restored B-25J sits in the main hall. Ironsides' revenge painted on the nose. 850 caliber gun barrels protruding from the solid metal nose. A beast, a weapon, a piece of history. A plaque reads, B-25J Commerce Destroyer, modified by Major Jack Brennan, 1942. Battle of Bismarck Sea, March 3, 1943. 12 enemy transports, 4 destroyers destroyed. Foundation for modern close air support doctrine. An elderly veteran stands in front of it, 94 years old, leaning on a cane. His great-grandson beside him, 8 years old, eyes wide. Papa, did you really fly in one of these? No, son. But I knew the man who invented them. Was he a hero? The veteran thought for a moment. He was a mechanic who refused to lose. And sometimes that's what heroes are. Jack Brennan never asked for medals, never wrote a memoir, never sought recognition. He just grabbed a wrench, broke some rules, and built a weapon that changed the course of a war. That's the America I remember. The America that doesn't wait for permission. The America that sees a problem and fixes it. Not because it's easy, because it's necessary. The greatest generation wasn't great because they were perfect. They were great because when the world was burning, they didn't complain about the heat. They grabbed a bucket and got to work. If this story moved you, honor Jack Brennan's memory by sharing it. Make sure the next generation knows that freedom isn't free. It's built by people willing to sacrifice everything. Hit that like button, subscribe. And in the comments, tell us what American values do you think we need to preserve for the next generation. The experts said it couldn't fly, but Jack Brennan never asked for permission. He just grabbed a wrench and built the future.